My name is Ori. It's great to have you all here for these upcoming 2.5 days in this big conference on responsibility and changing landscape. I'd like first of all to welcome specifically and thank all of those who have come from abroad and made the travel to be with us here, and we look forward to hearing from all of you during our discussions, but also the audience that has joined us for this conference. The topic is responsibility, which as I think we already know even without doing the conference is difficult to grasp, explain, or decipher. And when we were organizing this conference, I was asked several times by people we invited or just told about this project. Well, what does the Center for Jewish and Democratic Law have to do with responsibility, right? How come you're not dealing with questions of law and religion and stuff like that, which would be the natural habitat of such a center? And I chose the easy way out, which is to cite someone else as an answer. So I brought this poem I'd like to open the conference with, which is also kind of a nice bracketing mechanism because we're going to finish with an actual poet who's going to read from some of her works. So let me start with a short poem by Yehuda Amichai, who's a famous a late Israeli poet. I'll read it in Hebrew first and then my own translation in English. So it's called Anashim Nashim Vataf. Anashim Nashim Vataf, יהודים, נוצרים ומוסלמים. אני רוצה להיות שייך למשהו ולקבל יחס מיוחד והנחה. שוטרים, חיילים וסטודנטים, אלמנות, יתומים והורים שכולים, נכים, ילדים, פנסיונרים, ולהיות בלי אחריות. חרש, שוטה וקטן. אוהבים, נפרדים ומתים. אני רוצה להיות בתוך איזה סדר משולש. תפילה, תשובה וצדקה. דם, יזע ודמעות. שוויון, חופש ואחוות העמים. ים, יבשה ואוויר. משהו קבוע. קדוש, קדוש, קדוש. שקט, שקט, שקט. And here's my attempt at an English translation. Men, women, and children. Jews, Christians, and Muslims. I want to belong to something and get special treatment and a discount. Policemen, soldiers, and students, widows, orphans, and grieving parents, the disabled, children, the retired, and be without responsibility, the deaf, the fool, and the little one. Loving, separating, and dying. I want to be in some triadic order. Prayer, repentance, and charity. Blood, sweat, and tears. Equality, liberty, and fraternity. Ocean, land, and air. Something fixed. Sacred, 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 quiet, quiet, quiet. Well, we could do a session about that, I guess. But one thing I like from this poem is kind of the connection it suggests between our kind of affinity with kind of mathematical order and structure and stuff like that, and the way once we find that or locate ourselves in some sort of an order, we sort of relinquish some sense of responsibility. And I think in one way or another, most of our discussions are going to be to revolve around these kinds of dynamics in which kind of law as a structure, as an order, comes in and how that affects our perceptions of responsibility, where that sort of plays into existing orders, castes, arrangements, agreements. One word about the center, and then as a conference as a kind of byproduct of that. The center itself, and Shachar will speak about more about this later today, but I think one way of defining its mission is kind of disrupting existing orthodoxies about what Jewish, what democratic means, and what they can mean together, and so coming up with different ideas about the combinations that these two systems of value create. And also when we conference or we workshop or we do these kind of academic events, we also try to kind of disrupt a little bit the kind of orthodoxies of academic deliberation. So this is also what we try to do here in the program, to include different modes of communication and deliberation among us, learning, teaching, discussing, replying. So I hope you all enjoy the program as much as we've sort of enjoyed coming up with it. I'd like, just before I pass over to the speakers, just to acknowledge a few members of the kind of organizing team. First of all, Dr. Tomo Shadmi will also chair the next session, who's kind of the intellectual force behind the whole project of responsibility here at the center. Our dean and director of the center, Shachar Lifshitz, sitting here at the table, both members of the organizing committee. Sylvie Lipsker standing there at the door, and our two amazing students, Mirav Knafo and Maya Dvori, whom you've met at the entrance. You should also know them because they will be able to help you if you get lost or anything like of that sort. Drinks and coffee, bathroom out there. Tomo Shadmi, please take over.
Thank you, Ori. I'm very excited and honored to open the first panel of the conference with our special keynote talk given by Professor Moyn. Responsibility has become today a buzzword, a trend, the new black. The theme of the G8 meeting this year in Davos was responsibility. TrendWatch, which is a company specializing in identifying trends, dedicates the opening season of its global yearly event in November to the concept of responsibilities. And I just saw yesterday that MIT just offered a prize on responsible disobedience. So usually we become obsessed with things after we lose them. We read poems on love when our hearts have been broken and realize the importance of health just when we are sick. When we have love and health, they are often so natural to us that they become invisible or are taken for granted. For quite a long time, nobody talked about responsibilities and duties. They were invisible for us simply because we had them. But it seems that those times are gone. Ulrich Beck wrote that the global regime today is a regime of organized irresponsibility. Trump's latest decision to quit the climate change agreement illustrates this irresponsibility perfectly. But on the other hand, some American state reaction to this decision and also the French President Macron's reaction illustrate the other tendency, the other side, the search for new channels of responsibility. Macron said that we all share the same responsibility, make our planet great again. So when Macron and us try today to come back and conceptualize responsibility after long years of silence, it is not an easy job. So for this difficult mission of finding the invisible roots of duties and responsibilities, we have here the special agent, Professor Samuel Moyn, who in 2010 in his famous book, The Last Utopia, reframed the whole human rights field, the history of human rights. And today we will ask him to give us some clues maybe on the next utopia. So, Professor Samuel Moyn is Professor of Law and History at Harvard University. He received a doctorate in Modern European History from the University of California, Berkeley in 2000, and law degree from Harvard University in 2001. He spent 13 years in the Columbia University History Department, where he was most recently James Bryce Professor of European Legal History. He has written several books, including Origin of the Other, Emmanuel Levinas, Between Revelation and Ethics, and The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, as well as edited and co-edited a number of others. He's the editor of the interdisciplinary journal Humanity and co-editor of Modern Intellectual History, and works with several other publications. His area of interest in legal scholarship include international law, human rights, and the law of war, and legal thought in both historical and current perspective. So, please.
Okay, well, thank you to Tomer and Shachar for organizing this event and having me. Look, a couple of years ago, I think it occurred to me that there are so many books now about the history of the idea of rights, and I've even contributed more than my share. But I don't know of a single book about the history of duties. And so I'm at the beginning of thinking about the topic, and this conference is perfectly timed since I can learn a lot from the rest of it about how you might think about such a history. This is a first attempt at best. So start in 1947 when Julian Huxley, who was then the Director General of UNESCO, wrote a letter to Mohandas Gandhi and asked him to contribute to what's now a famous collection of philosophical approaches to human rights from the 40s. But Gandhi said he didn't want to be part of it. He said instead that there should be a universal declaration of human duties. I learned from my illiterate but wise mother, Gandhi wrote in a letter that Huxley included in the volume just for good measure, that all rights to be deserved and preserved came from duty well done. The very right to live accrues to us only when we do the duty of citizenship of the world. Citizenship of the world. Now, this wasn't like a one-off for Gandhi. In his masterpiece, Hind Swaraj, which dates back to 1909, Gandhi bemoans what he calls the farce of everyone wanting and insisting on rights, nobody thinking of duty. And even during World War II, H.G. Wells, who's known as having propounded his own little Bill of Rights for as a statement of war aims, asked Gandhi to support it, but the Mahatma responded that Wells should write a cosmopolitan charter of duties instead, a statement of what citizens of the world owe one another. Now, as you know, shortly after this letter from Gandhi to Huxley, Gandhi was dead. Assassinated in January 1948, Gandhi didn't live to see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was already in process. In our own age, as you see from this Google Ngram, which measures the prominence of words and phrases, human rights politics have come into their own. And in fact, the emphasis on duties looks idiosyncratic. All the languages we can test show this same result. Human rights are spiking, at least in our language, whereas the notion of duties is, again, at the level of language in a terminal decline, apparently. I attempted with my, primitive Hebrew to make a Hebrew version of this chart I usually use, and it's basically the same. Although, like Mandarin, it's a bit delayed. You get the spike of human rights starting in the 1980s in the Hebrew. Now, you'll immediately tell me that the human rights revolution in which we're living today doesn't mean that there aren't duties. In fact, there's a wide range of duties that human rights impose, at least on states. And I'll speak in a moment, and many of you will speak later about the doctrine of the correlativity of rights and duties. And international law, more than ever, has imposed duties to respect, protect, and fulfill those rights on states and possibly others, and national schemes of rights protection go far further and have teeth. We should never forget this fact. But of course, this doesn't mean that there's a comparable public discourse about or political prominence of duties in our day. And as a result of this fact, we're very familiar with the claim in public that humans as such have rights, much less so that those rights involve the imposition of duties on possibly a large range of actors. One of the great philosophers of duties all those years ago when the human rights revolution was first starting out noticed this fact. That's Honora O'Neill, who said in her famous book on Faces of Hunger in 1986 that given correlativity, it's not obvious why there shouldn't be a universal declaration of human duties and why there shouldn't be an international human obligations movement. And for her, at that point in her career, this omission of much interest in duties, those correlative to the rights in, say, the Universal Declaration, had grave implications for rights protection itself. But maybe more broadly, we could argue that there may be lots of duties that don't correlate with individual rights. There might be lots of duties, of course some moral philosopher would have to establish them, of individuals to their own states or to humanity in general, and duties of states to one another that don't correlate with an individual right. We might ask if there's a duty to provide housing and food that follows from economic and social rights. Do individuals also have a duty to pay taxes to the state to ensure that it can do so? Is inequality, about which we're talking so much, a matter of rights violation or exclusively rights violation, especially if there's no right to fair distribution in any sources that I know about? Or ought there to be a duty that might address some of our concerns about inequality? You might ask the same questions about the environmental crisis, whether we should best think of that in a framework that sticks to individual rights. Now, I don't want to claim to have any answers to this, and I expect that the conference will take up all of these sorts of problems. What I'd like to do is try to think about what a historian like me might do to help in thinking about the annals of the history of theory and philosophy, to put Gandhi in a larger canon, if you will, and think about what sources we have to draw on, what a book on the history of duties to answer all of those books on the histories of rights might look like. What might we say about that? Well, to begin with, I think we'd have to start with the obvious fact that rights emerged to disrupt the huge predominance of the imposition of duties on individuals for millennia. I'm not going to distinguish, others may later in the conference, between duties, obligations, and responsibilities. But we can say very simply that the main content of the various religious faiths we know over the millennia was the imposition of duties on individuals who had no rights as a general matter in those systems, which doesn't mean they couldn't change in more liberal times. But take, since we're in Israel, the example of Judaism. According to the founder of human rights law, Louis Henkin, Judaism, as he speaks from some knowledge as an observant Jew, has no rights in it, only duties, and the duties are to God. If there's a rights bearer in the picture of this religion, it's God himself. And of course, if you want to tell a story about the lineages of secular political theory, if we go into Western ethical theory, whether we start with Cicero, whose textbook on ethics was generally translated as On Duties and served as the main text for young men to learn about ethics for centuries, or beyond, we have a centrality of duties that's, I think, quite remarkable from present perspective. What happened? I think this is itself an interesting historical problem. I have a little quotation here from a French thinker named Raymond Aron, and what he says in this quotation is that it's difficult, whether in high schools or universities, to talk seriously about the duties of citizens. I think that whoever risked doing so would seem like he belongs to a disappeared world. And I think that's true. We might wonder how it happened that duties were dethroned, at least as a matter of public discourse. And there might be some answers we'd entertain. I'll entertain them briefly. The first you might entertain is the rise of liberalism and liberal rights, and thus political modernity, from whatever you want to date that event. Now, as I'll argue in the rest of the talk, that's going to be a very misleading approach, because many liberals themselves were more interested in duties than rights for much of the history of liberalism. Honore O'Neill herself, in a fascinating lecture she sometimes gives, which you can look at on YouTube, has claimed that it was really World War I that decisively broke the hegemony of the idea of duties, at least in Western societies, with subservience to the state and military obligation for the sake of the state losing its credibility as a result of World War I. I'm not sure that's right either. I think there's going to be a strong connection to the post-1970s libertarian or neoliberal world in which we're living, and of which human rights can be seen as having an obscure, not one-to-one, but interesting relationship. And so all of those assumptions are affecting what I'm going to try to do, which is ransack the tradition, at least as I know it, very little, to look for a worthwhile canon of duty theorists who might help us flirt with the renewal of duties today. Now, I want to place some constraints on this search. I don't want to go back to the pre-modern, because it was right for liberalism to overthrow the imposition of duties without rights on individuals as it did. On ethical grounds, it seems to be a non-starter to return to a pre-modern status quo ante, but that doesn't mean we need to give up any public commitment to or talk about duties. More important, as I'll try to suggest, and I've already started with Gandhi, there can and maybe needs to be a cosmopolitan theory of duties, and it turns out there are some sources. Most of all, I'm personally most interested in finding a theory of duties that can save our interest in rights from their current entanglements with a neoliberalism or libertarianism. And it might be possible that a return to duties can help liberals themselves avoid these recent entanglements. Now, before I launch into my very short and spotty history, I'll just say one last word about correlativity, which is that, of course, it's true that we need a lot of sophisticated philosophical insight into what correlativity means and what its implications are. Well, all I want to suggest very minimally is that if it's the case that rights are duties and vice versa, or rights give rise to duties and vice versa, that doesn't, of course, mean that as a matter of public political morality, there's much presence for duties. And more important, as I've already tried to suggest, we may want to embed individual rights in a much larger framework of duties that citizens might owe their states or humanity, and states might owe one another. Okay, so what would such a canon be if we tried to construct a canon of the theorists of duties, much as we have a canon of the history of rights going back to Aquinas, or if that's too early, Locke or beyond? I'd like to get your suggestions. These are the gentlemen and two ladies I've come up with. Sadly, I'll only have time to talk about two of these individuals in great detail. One will be the Italian liberal Giuseppe Mazzini, and the other is the British idealist T.H. Green. But of course, if one wanted to continue this story into the present, there are interesting people like Honora O'Neill, whom I've already mentioned, and Jeremy around the table, and so forth. What I do want to do about these folks is make a couple of broad generalizations about the nature of the story of duties over time in philosophy and political theory before turning to my main examples, whom I've mentioned. So the first generalization I want to make is that the Enlightenment needs to be reinterpreted as much more devoted to a moral theory propounding duties and rights only as part of such a larger moral theory. That was certainly the case for a theorist like the first man in my canon, Samuel Pufendorf, and the second, Immanuel Kant, even though the latter is now interpreted as one of the great rights theorists, and rightly so. In his teaching and in his broader thought, I think he and most other Enlightenment thinkers in natural law traditions were much more interested in broad notions of duties. And the historians who work on this period, I'm not one of them, have begun to insist that our post-1970s histories of philosophy have distorted things in precisely this respect. After John Rawls published A Theory of Justice in 1971, the historiography of rights was launched, to begin with Richard Tuck's great book. And almost systematically, a lineage for Rawls was sought, and with Nozick for a more libertarian vision of rights. What got lost, according to one of our very best historians of 18th century natural law, is how peripheral a more libertarian or voluntarist theory of natural law really was within Enlightenment thinking more broadly. He goes very far, Knud Haakonssen, in making this claim, in saying that the development of the notion of natural rights wasn't very central to early modern natural law if we reconstruct it fairly. It's like a matter of floating islands in the sea of duties. Now, in this period, it's fair to say that a more libertarian view, economic and otherwise, began to emerge. And it was a necessary thing for it to do so because, of course, the old regime and the sway of religious tradition and aristocratic and other forms of oppression certainly have never gone down without a fight. And so it's intelligible to us in retrospect that certain figures like Thomas Paine, whom I've shown you on this slide, really did think of the turn to human rights as an attempt to escape from the confinement of duty. And once again, I want to suggest that we owe them a lot. It was a good thing for liberals to insist on individual freedom from God's enforcers, tradition's weight, the state's prerogatives, and so forth. But there was this residual question, which is what liberals would have to say about duties and interdependence once they had asserted the individual's rights. The suggestion is that they, again, in the mainstream of liberal political theory, did not want to give up on duties. Instead, they wanted to reinvent the tradition of duties that had been the very center of Western moral theory for a new age. So this takes me to the second generalization I want to make before I talk about a couple of I think, preeminent individuals, which is that we really need to care about the 19th century if we're interested in this topic. The 19th century was the great age of the theory of duties. And it's in this age that liberals themselves understood, I think better than liberals have in our own day, the need to prioritize duties. And it was for two chief reasons that they had that commitment. For one thing, they understood liberalism less as a normative theory about the antecedents of individuals to the social order than as a historical and sociological phenomenon. And for them, individual freedom, which they prized, had to be a collective achievement that therefore depended on collective interdependence, which involved then some duties for the maintenance and indeed progress of the collective order of social freedom. So if that's the case, 19th century liberals didn't defend rights when they did because they believed that individuals enjoyed perfect freedom in the state of nature, a concept that 19th century liberals almost unanimously rejected. Rights, if they were plausible at all, were social entities like everything else and the achievement of long histories. And so for these 19th century liberals, the difference between good and bad states wasn't the difference between ones that respected pre-political rights from the state of nature and ones that didn't. Rather, they strove to think of a difference between states that balance social freedom with other valid collective purposes and those that didn't achieve that balance. But second, and I think much more important, 19th century liberals were more sensitive to the threat of libertarianism. And they tried to keep liberty in balance with other liberal ideals such as equality and fraternity. So for these two main reasons, their dogged insistence on maintaining an emphasis on duties for liberalism's own survival and prosperity was very strong. They knew that despots had droned on about duties of subjects to states, but in the face of the rise of unregulated capitalism 1.0, liberals of that time tried to renovate the older Republican idea that citizenship in a community of free people affords privileges but also incurs responsibilities. So this is why I want to focus in the balance of my talk on the 19th century. And especially, to begin with, on Giuseppe Mazzini. Now, he's almost a forgotten figure, except for certain Italians. I know we have one. He answered Thomas Paine, who famously wrote a book, The Rights of Man, to popularize the lessons of the French Revolution, with his own book called The Duties of Man. And I think it's only fair to give credit to Mazzini, however poor a philosopher he was and however forgotten he is now, as the most influential theorist of duties of modern times, especially as a global matter. And just as an example, Gandhi himself was a Mazzinian, and the entirety of, not the entirety, but a lot of the emphasis on duties that I started out with in Gandhi's thought comes directly from Mazzini. So I won't go into great detail, but Mazzini, as you can see from the few little quotations I have, really did want to orient moral and political thought to a new progressive theory of duties. More important, and again, anticipating Gandhi in the 1940s, he was one of the earliest self-styled cosmopolitans. He's best remembered as a nationalist theorist, and he was, but he was also a cosmopolitan who believed in the eventual unification of humanity through a social progress of interdependent people and peoples. What drove his activism at every scale, whether it was local and national or presumptively global, was that he believed in the need for social interdependence for progress to occur and for a balance to be achieved between individual emancipation and collective progress. Now, Mazzini, as you know, was a terrorist. He wrote terrorist manuals. He was in exile for that reason, and was, spent most of his life in London. Interestingly, once he got there, he tried to deny the very common and still regnant contrast in Anglo moral and political thought between rights and utility-based theories. Interestingly, Mazzini claimed they were versions of the same doctrine. This is one of my favorite quotations from Mazzini, which I think is still useful in today. He says, "I know the theory of rights doesn't find favor with Bentham by name, but for all who understand the spirit and not the mere dead letter of Bentham, this is evidently only a quarrel with the word. Bentham's writings recognize no idea superior to the individual, no collective starting point, no providential education of the human race." His point was not to dethrone the individual, and he was as much a follower of the French Revolution as Paine, but he did want to balance individual freedom and rights with the collective ends, and he hoped some vision of collectively interdependent progress. What he did in this main book that I'm briefly addressing, The Duties of Man, is lay out a doctrine of rights. And I'll leave to you what the content of a plausible theory of duties ought to be. What's interesting to me is not just that he propounded a theory focused on duties, but he propounded one that was irreducible to the state's duties to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of its citizens. Individuals had duties to one another and to all humanity. So he has an entire chapter in his book on duties to humanity. And his goal was to put individual rights and the local state in its broadest possible setting. Now, let me dwell for a moment on this quotation, because it takes me back to Gandhi and to a very important point that I want to make very clear. Like Gandhi, he seems to give a claim that rights only accrue once duties have been fulfilled, which seems to make individual rights conditional on service or the discharge of obligation. You see that clearly in this statement that we should think of the relationship of rights and duties that way. But I think there's a fairer or more constructive way of reading both Gandhi and Mazzini, and it's what I'd call a causal reading. What both seem to be really saying in the statements I've given you is that as a matter of fact, to the extent we don't establish networks of interdependence and obligations, rights themselves will go unfulfilled. So even to the extent we're interested in the priority of rights, or at least the equal priority of rights with duties that may fall on individuals, they will go unfulfilled in societies that focus only on rights fulfillment, or for that matter, movements that focus only on rights fulfillment. So I think he has in mind already, as Gandhi did, the famous quandary that human rights activists and movements have today, that they're very good at propounding norms, very bad at getting the norms enforced. And so these figures, I want to read them, let's say constructively, not as making rights parasitic on duties, but rather claiming that freedom will depend on having duties in the picture. The second main reason I want to try to dredge Mazzini out of the annals of the history of thought is that he was a counter-libertarian. He was very concerned that in a world of liberal rights, as generous as that may seem, as our liberal theories of rights are today, libertarianism in fact will win out unless it's explicitly counteracted. Now this may sound like a Marxist point, and in fact it is a Marxist point. Except that Mazzini made it too, and he was not just a fellow Londoner of Marx's, but Marx's great 19th century rival, widely understood to be such for many, many people down into the 20th century. Unlike Marx, Mazzini found in the concept of duties the critical tool that liberals needed to immunize liberty consecrated by rights theory from the libertarian heresy that he found so destructive. So you see in this quotation that he's worried that liberty, which he loves, is being perverted by specifically anti-statist doctrines. He wanted to make himself the standard bearer of a liberal movement that evoked the complex interdependence of human beings in a way that rights talk, with the best of intentions, could obscure. Especially, again, causally to the extent it ends up sharing the same timeline or falling into the gravitational pull of the defense of property and contract. Now, let me turn then to the second figure I want to deal with, T.H. Green, because you might claim that whatever Mazzini's salience for Gandhi and for a worldwide community of liberal nationalists and cosmopolitans, Anglo-American liberals are the rights theorists whom we've decided to inherit today. But of course, that's not faithful to the actual history of Anglo-American liberalism, as perhaps the greatest of the later 19th century liberals, T.H. Green, the Oxford moralist, demonstrates. And of course, he's another example, maybe the second most important example, of a liberal who wanted to prioritize duties as a theoretical matter. Now, he did so in a liberal environment, and his great biographer, Melvin Richter, who wrote a wonderful book about him decades ago, argued that Green could go so far in his attacks on the concepts of rights and liberty because he counted those concepts as already secure in his day, which, we may find naive or innocent. And yet, for whatever reason, Green insisted that duties had gotten lost and needed to be made the central topic of a liberal political theory. For example, in his major work called Lectures on the Principles of Political Obligation. Now, what was the nature of his arguments? Well, I won't go into detail. This is all preparatory for a book that I haven't written, may never write, and I'd really like to hear what other figures ought to be included. But once again, as a classic 19th century figure, Green's point of departure was an attack on the idea that there are such things as socially antecedent individuals who are vested with rights. The popular effect, he writes, of the notion that the individual brings with him into society certain rights is seen in the inveterate irreverence of the individual towards the state and the assumption that he has rights against society, irrespectively of his fulfillment of any duties to society. Now, I'll note two things about this quotation. First, you note these figures are statists. They want to grow the state and give it more tasks. They're not anti-totalitarian theorists of rights as we have known in the 20th century. Second, you do note the troubling implication in this quotation too, that rights enjoyment is going to be contingent on duty fulfillment, which again is something I personally want to read out of these figures. But more generally, his main claim was that liberals needed to pay much more attention to rights. If he claimed there are such things as innate rights, then it's not in any other sense than that in which there are also innate duties. That's a quotation to which he added, sadly, of duties much less has been heard. Now, why, in his own historical context, did he care to re-enthrone duties for liberals? Well, he was paving the way for something we now know as new liberalism, and what we would call in an American context the political theory of legal realism and the New Deal, though none of those phenomena were exactly Hegelian in the way that Green was. All of these movements focused on duties to oppose the libertarian presumption that state intrusion to allegedly free domains of market activities were per se violations of rights. They attacked the notion of rights as metaphysical entities and instead wanted to develop a theory of rights as social goods whose justification ultimately lay in collective purposes. And so it's not surprising that the classic legal realists whom we study in the United States, like Robert Hale and Carl Llewellyn, come directly out of these traditions and devoted themselves to a comparable deconstruction of at least a kind of metaphysical theory of rights in the name of a theory of social duty and obligation. Let me head towards a conclusion by suggesting that duties were central to the welfare state and its construction in the middle of the 20th century, not rights. There's been a huge amount of attention to the period of the 1940s in my own little field of human rights history, and reasonably so, because it's then that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was propounded. And just as in prior liberal traditions, whether in the Enlightenment or other times, historians have ransacked the period to try to find the origins of our own period's specific interest in doctrines and movements of human rights. But once again, at the time the welfare state was being announced as the highest ideals, not just across the Atlantic, but through decolonization as it was beginning around the world, duties were much more central. A fair reconstruction of the 1940s, just as of the Enlightenment, shows that it may have been the high point for the salience of notions of duties. I'll just give a few examples of this before focusing for just a couple of minutes on E.H. Carr as a last figure. So I'll just mention Simone Weil, who in 1943 propounded a declaration of duties towards mankind as part of her work in the French resistance. I'll mention the figures in the World Federalist movement around the University of Chicago, who met in the 1940s as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was in process to propound a world constitution. And yet they included in their world constitution a declaration of duties and rights, one that included the duty of spiritual excellence. There is a late article in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights concerning duties, which others may take up, but it's worth noting that Latin Americans went further 6 months before the Universal Declaration, they propounded in spring 1948 an American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man. So I don't have time to talk about any of these examples, but I will just mention E.H. Carr, who was one of the helpers of Huxley in starting this UNESCO philosophical survey, to which he contributed, but then he took the trouble of writing a review of the survey in the TLS, which I guess fit with the academic propriety of that time. And quite interestingly, in this TLS review, little snippets I've given to you here, he was quite representative of the 1940s in claiming that whatever the importance of announcing rights, as the UNESCO symposium itself showed, what was really happening in the 1940s was a very large liberal, not to mention non-liberal shift towards a doctrine of duties. So you see here in his piece, Rights and Obligations from 1949, Carr writes that in fact, the unqualified upholders of 18th century bills of rights are surprisingly few amongst philosophers. And of course, that's true. We don't really find many mainstream philosophers other than Catholics in that period who are really doggedly committed to a theory of rights for its own sake until decades later. And you see in the right passage, which I've snipped, the claim that in fact what liberals, and not to mention non-liberals in the Soviet Union are doing, is developing new theories of citizenship. Now today, of course, I would say as a broad generalization that an explicit liberal emphasis of duties seems to be a distant memory relative to the history I've been discussing. Why? Well, political theory lost track of it except as a matter of correlativity. I want to insist that the people I'm talking about were not necessarily like the communitarians who've tried to resist this result in our time. The liberals I'm interested in this lecture understood social interdependence as a setting for personal freedom, not a substitute for personal freedom. Much more importantly, at least in Mazzini and Gandhi, they were not interested in virtue in local settings, the typical concern of communitarians, but interdependence potentially at a global scale. That's why I started out with Gandhi's cosmopolitan interest. And yet, whether or not that's persuasive to you, I do think it's fair to say that due to the prestige of human rights, liberals, whether in their domestic projects or in the international ones, have generally failed to present us with powerful public visions of social interdependence, collective agency, or planetary responsibility. Now, this is true. It forces us to consider why our age, since approximately the 1970s, is, even with respect to the history of liberalism, a historical outlier. And whether we might want to remediate this fact. Might it be a good thing for rights activists, to the extent they care about rights enforcement, to cross the border into becoming a duties movement? And might we want to consider a yet broader duties movement that restored things like the duty to pay taxes as a citizen, not to mention cosmopolitan duties, especially given my president's recent actions with regards to the Paris Pact. So whether we're interested in the inequalities of neoliberalism or the catastrophes of the environment, it seems as if a return to duties are an inevitability. But, of course, most that we see are bad. And I want to close with this fact, that there have been calls to return to duties. Most of them seem toxic and unpersuasive to me. Whether you take the misbegotten Asian values debate of the 90s, in which Lee Kuan Yew and others claim that Western liberalism runs afoul of local communities and duties, or other examples like Gordon Brown's 2007 call for a new Bill of Rights and Duties, which has escalated to a full-scale resistance to human rights under his conservative successors. These seem like the call to duties amongst many religious communities to be largely surreptitious means of scanting individual freedom, which was not at all the liberal goal in the 19th century. It was rather to discover a social freedom. I'd even say the same about this Universal Declaration of Human Responsibilities for 1997, which comes from some similar elite state actors, but we'd have to look at it in detail. Maybe most perniciously, the language of duties tends to be revived by libertarians themselves, to claim that duties force us to roll back the state so that welfare mothers and so forth take personal responsibility. A wonderful new book, if you haven't heard of it, by Yasha Monk, called The Age of Responsibility, talks about even amongst liberals themselves, this form of so-called luck egalitarianism has risen that's tended to track the attack on the welfare state. And that's a bad thing. And yet, bad or destructive theories of duties only provide a poor excuse for ignoring potentially beneficial liberal returns to duties. To the extent we care about values like socioeconomic equality, global justice, environmental welfare, or again, rights protection itself, duties could matter once again. And since our problems are inevitably global, and that's clearer every day, the Mazzinian and Gandhian cosmopolitan theory of duties seems to me especially worthy of recovery. So I conclude. Thank you for listening. I haven't said anything agonizingly about the philosophical details, but then I'm not a philosopher about the content of a proposed theory of duties. I'm interested in an intellectual historian and giving us something to go on, to prompt a discussion about what the history of human duties is, so far unwritten, so that we can decide whether and how to reestablish duties for ourselves. We would have to debate the source and content of a doctrine of duties, but no more so than when it comes to a theory of rights. We've had a lot of historical work about duties, and what I've tried to do very minimally is take a first step towards writing a history. We've had a lot of work about the history of rights, and I've tried to take a first step towards a history of duties as a prompt to what looks to be an exciting conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Moyn, for a super inspiring talk. And now Professor Yair Lorber-Broim will respond. Professor Yair Lorber-Broim is a member of the Bar-Ilan University Faculty of Law, where he lectures on philosophy of law, Jewish law, and Jewish thought. Professor Lorber-Broim has been guest lecturer at Yale University, Cardozo Law School, Princeton University, the NYU Law School. He served as a professor of Talmudic law in the University of Pennsylvania Law School and was a star fellow at the Center of Jewish Studies at Harvard University. Professor Lorber-Broim's scholarly work includes the book In God's Image, Myths, Theology, and Law in the Classical Judaism from 2015 in English. And he is co-author of the first volume of the Jewish political tradition published by Yale University Press and Melech Evion, Kinship in Classical Judaism. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Sam's lecture and essay, basically I'm responding on a paper or an essay that he published in Boston Review, which I really recommend. I got it. It's basically similar to the talk he gave here today. And I think this paper is really innovative and stimulating, and I tend to agree with most of his points here, but yet at the same time, I have some questions and issues that I need to clarify here, and I'll make some brief comments about it, and then I'll, try to open up the discussion. It's really true that the history of duties, obligations, responsibilities is a central and a salient thing, and it's salient and important not only for intellectual purposes, but also for very burning practical and political issues. And I understand, as Sam said, this essay is only the beginning of a very real big project that he's going to take on himself, namely carrying this mantle, and I'm really looking forward. And what I'm going to say here is just really questions in order to clarify some points that he'll make, and maybe points that he'll make in the future in his big project that I'm personally looking forward to read. What I'll make is some, I would say, conceptual and maybe methodological comments, and some of them would be conceptual, substantial, and you shouldn't take it so much as a criticism, but more like a questions that would open up and invite a discussion. Now, the main, as I understood it, the main claim that Sam makes, and here I'm quoting, he says as follows, and I think he said it also in his presentation: today, unlike in the past, and especially in the 19th century, however, liberal emphasis on duties is a distant memory at every scale. Political theory, and I'm emphasizing political theory, lost track of the concept in the second half of the 20th century. Now, what he suggests is to return back to these traditions of the 19th century and to go back to the very concept of duty. And then he says, the question such traditions leave behind is whether it is correct in our own day to renovate rather than reject an emphasis on duties, and to do so on the scale of global interdependence. And as I said, in order to do this, he wants to go back to the writers who wrote on duties and responsibilities and study from them. And the last quote I want to make from his essay is he says, reclaiming, and this is the very last paragraph of the essay, he says, reclaiming the history of duties is a first step toward the thinking and practice that might justifiably lead to reclaiming duties themselves. Now, I want to examine some of these I would say, arguments, and ask whether really political theories in the second half of the 20th century really neglected or left behind completely the very concept of duty. And in what sense did they do so? And if they, the question is whether it's better to understand what they did, not so much in the sense of leaving behind the very idea of duty, but really speaking about or neglecting specific duties that they didn't want to speak about, and this is the trouble we have with them. It's not so much the idea of thinking about duties, but speaking about certain duties that we think people ought, or philosophers ought, or politicians ought, whatever, to speak about, and the issue is not so much the very idea of duty. Now, in order to make this question a bit more clear, I want to make two distinctions here. One is between two senses or different senses of what we speak about when we speak about duties. And I want to ask Sam whether he wants to argue that liberals or liberal thinkers in the second half or the second half of the 20th century really left behind this idea of duty, and whether it's true not only about the liberals, but about, I would say, public discourse, whether we really lack this idea within the public discourse among philosophers, educators, in the media, and so on and so forth. And the second is whether we should, while dealing with this idea or this argument, make some distinctions between different realms of discourse about duties. And when I say different realms, we should speak about, on the one hand, philosophers, theoretical philosophers, the philosophical literature, and then the media or education or the legal profession and so on and so forth. And I'm not sure that all these realms are really the same in terms of how we think about, or the situation of duties in each of every realm. Now, about the first distinction, I would say that it seems to me, at least, that everyone would agree that the very concept of duty, or the idea of responsibility, didn't really disappear from the discourse nowadays in the second half of the, I don't think that's true in the United States, that's not true in Israel. I think people speak about responsibilities, speak about duties, speak about all these things. We don't lack them. I think in some situations even have them too much. The question is whether they speak about the right responsibilities and the right duties, and the real, I would say, quarrel and fight between people is what are really the duties. It's not the very idea of duty. The question is whether the duty should be this and what should be the priorities. That's the main issue. Now, the main argument of some, if I understood it correctly, is that a certain type of duties were forgotten or left behind. And this has to do with the liberal discourse or the discourse of, I would say, human rights. Though, if you read him carefully along the essay, he speaks mainly about a cluster of specific duties that has to do with the socioeconomic equality, global justice, and environmental welfare. Yet at the same time, while he speaks about this cluster, these specific duties, which are very important and very crucial for our age, he at the same time speaks about the very idea of duty and the idea that liberals have some difficulties speaking about duty as such. But if we'll agree that both philosophers, intellectuals, educators, media people, and so on and so forth, didn't really neglect the idea of duty, and they are still speaking in terms of duty and so on and so forth, is it really true that we left behind in the public discourse, I would say, the very idea of duty or obligation or responsibility, or the issue is really a fight about what the real, I would say, values are and what we should really make an effort for, and whether, we should fight for this or fight for that. Now, Sam also argues that liberalism didn't develop, I would say, the discourse of what one could call human duties, which is the counterpart of human rights. Now, human duties is a kind of a weird, I would say, term. Usually we speak about duties and human rights. Maybe we should innovate the idea of human duties. And these human duties are quite specific. And if, according to, and the question is, and I tend to agree with that, but then we have to really kind of pinpoint exactly what we mean by that the reluctance to speak about them and to develop them raises really the question, do liberals have difficulties in speaking about duties as such? My intuition is that this is not the issue. The issue is not that liberals don't have a difficulty speaking about duties. Maybe they have some difficulty about managing all sorts of discussions and quarrels and debates about how to make a good, I would say, case for a certain duty here and there, and maybe we should do it in different ways. But the very idea of speaking about duties, I'm not sure that this is the real problem that we face today. Now, I want to turn to the second distinction that I want to make, which I think is also crucial for this whole project. It has to do with, I would maybe make a distinction between three realms of discussing the very idea of existence of duties. One is the philosophical, theoretical level. If we go to philosophers who write about rights and duties and so on and so forth, what we teach in, I would say, in classes and write about and so on and so forth. The second one is the public discourse, which I think is a different discourse from the philosophical one. And here the public discourse also could be divided to all sorts of sub-realms, like, in the media, in universities, in school, educators, clergymen, and so on and so forth. And then the third one, I think, which is also should be dealt separately from the first two, is the discourse of loyals, which is, I think, different from the first two discourses. And I think this is true both in the States and in Israel. And one should ask himself whether the way all these discourses deal or use the term responsibility, duty, and so on and so forth is the same, and whether the difficulties in terms of duties is the same in each and every one of them. And I want to add also that if we think about the idea of duty and we want to return back to the issue of duty, I think we have to ask two different questions relating to each and every realm within this distinction. One, is it true, as I said, that the discussion of responsibilities and duties was left behind? And if it is so, is it because of the same reasons? And the second question was whether we want in each and every realm to return back to speaking about duties. Just to say, for example, I'm not sure that I want lawyers to speak a lot about duties. I want the duties to be kept, really strictly as they are within the legal system. I don't want any more duties enacted by any parliament, and I think Sam would agree with me. So we want people to speak about duties, but we don't want to really enact them. I want to speak with my students about duties and so on and so forth, but the question is how exactly to do it in which situation. Now I want to make another point which goes back to the philosophical theoretical level or realm. And here I want to go back to John Rawls, which Sam also mentioned. Now, one of the main arguments Sam made is that from the middle of the 20th century on, philosophers, theoreticians left behind the idea of duty. But now I would say that anybody who knows something about, I would say, the philosophical liberal writings in the 20th century would agree that Rawls is probably the most important and salient writer in this field. It's not only Rawls, we're speaking about a huge amount of literature that was written on him, agreeing with him, developing him, disagreeing with him, and so on and so forth. This, I would say, is the most central writing in liberal thought in the second half of the century, and I would argue that this is true till today. Now, if we think about what is the real innovation of Rawls compared to the liberal thinking of the first half of the 20th century and the 19th century, I think the main contribution is the idea of putting together social justice and liberties and freedoms, and trying to put them together in a sense that liberals didn't think in the same way before. That's true about most of the liberals of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. Now, everybody knows that whenever you read Rawls, you see that one of the main things that really entered his philosophy is the Kantian notion. All sorts of Kantian notions are very central to Rawls, which is really absent from any other philosopher before him. And the very idea of social justice and distributive justice has to do with issues with the concept of responsibility, with the concept of duty. This is not so much the idea of a right. You could say just the other way around. So if this is the real, I would say, new prophecy of the liberals of the second half of the 20th century, I would just argue, and I have 2 minutes or 3 minutes, I'll finish at time. I would just argue, if we just focus on Rawls, and I think focusing on Rawls is not focusing on somebody just on the sidelines of I would say the liberal thinking, is that just the other way around. I would argue that in the second half of the 20th century, the very idea of putting together social justice and liberalism means that people thought in terms of responsibilities, in terms of duties and so on and so forth. Now, you could say that you don't find or encounter the term duty or responsibility enough in Rawls's writings, or those in Rawls's writing, but I'm not sure that this is the test. The test is more the conceptual, I would say, approach, which means that what Rawls wants us to do is just to combine, I would say, Mill with Kant together, and the very idea of subscribing to Kant is basically subscribing to I would say, the essence of Kant is the idea of duty and obligation. So in that sense, I'm not sure that, maybe I'm wrong about it. Maybe I'm wrong about it, but just if I'm thinking about roles here, I think the description should be a bit different. Two more points I want to make about the term duty. Now, as we know, the term duty is a very elusive term from the philosophical point of view. When I say elusive, I mean to say that, what do we mean by duty and where does it come from? How do we really substantiate it? And if we look in the history of philosophy, starting from the Greeks, going on to the Middle Ages, and then in the early modernity and so on and so forth, we could see different accounts giving to the very idea of duty. What does it mean that we are under an obligation, being under a duty? And we see that these different accounts basically mean that different authors and in different schools and trends, though they use the term duty, they mean completely different things. And because they mean completely different things, it doesn't mean that whenever you encounter the term duty here and there, it seems to be that they mean the same thing. And here I'll turn to the Jewish tradition in which I want to just end. Or maybe, Sam mentioned, just to give an example, just mentioned Cicero on the one hand, and then Kant on the other hand, both of them speaking about duties. But if you really look into the way Cicero understands what a duty is, and then Kant what he meant by duty, I think they have completely different ideas about duties. Now, to put them together and say, well, they belong to the same tradition speaking about duties, I think this is something that we should rethink. Going back, and this is my last point, and with this I would conclude, is about the Jewish tradition, or religions in general. Some tend to think that if you are religious, you speak about duties, while if you're a liberal, you speak about, I would say, rights. And when you speak about duties, you speak about, at least the monotheistic religions, and especially Judaism, they only speak about duties. And Sam also mentioned here Louis Henkin, the famous writer who said, and here I quote, "Judaism knows not rights but duties. At bottom, all duties are to God." Now here I want to say something about this. This is very common among writers and also Israeli writers, speaking that if we're Jewish, we only speak about duties, we don't speak about rights. Maybe it's true that we don't speak about rights, but if you go to the Jewish tradition, starting from the Bible, going then to rabbinic literature, and then going to the Middle Ages, speaking about Maimonides on the one hand and the Kabbalists and the mystics on the other hand, and you try to understand how they understood what a duty is, how they understand the very concept of duty, you'll see that the differences are so profound that just to put everybody at the same, I would say the same phrase, duty, and to think that they think about duties in the same way, I think it's completely wrong. Just to add to this, the fulfilling the commandments, or the halachic life, is something which is very central in the Jewish tradition. And we tend to think about the commandments, and the halacha is something which is, everything is a duty. Now, if we really analyze the religiosities or the different religiosities which stand at the basis of the halachic life in different periods, we'll find out that the different religiosities, the differences between them are profound. And this has to do really with the way they understood what a religious person means by being under an obligation. I would argue that what Louis Henkin here has to say about is basically fitting a very certain specific religiosity that has to do with fulfilling the commandments. But while if you compare him to different views that one could find in the Bible, one could find in rabbinic literature, one could find, let's say, in Maimonides, which in Maimonides himself you could find different, I would say, views about what duty or the halachic life is. This depends whether you look in his halachic writings or in his philosophical writings in the Guide of the Perplexed. And then if you go to mystics, which is maybe the central, I would say, tradition within the Jewish, in the Jewish tradition, starting from the late 12th century and then on, you'll see that they have a completely different sense of what the duty of fulfilling the commandments are. I'll end up here, and thank you very much, Sam, and I'm looking forward for this book, really.
Thank you, Professor Lorogon, for your insightful response. We will hear now Professor Moyn respond, and then we will open it to the audience.
Okay, I'll just be very brief, since I take it Yair has brilliantly, broached many themes we'll want to discuss the entire conference. I take it that one claim you want to make is that the concept of duties ought to be avoided, when treated too abstractly on two different grounds. One is that theorists of duties assign such radically different meanings to the concept that it's not useful to dwell on it too abstractly. And secondly, because it's hard to say that as a general matter that the concept of duties has waxed or waned at any particular time. If that ground's stable, we should really talk about what content does the concept of duties have? What content should we argue for? So you might be right on both arguments. I'll just suggest that in my own little history field, there have been lots of histories of rights in general, none of duties. I take it completely that if we're interested in a certain religious tradition, especially in the pre-modern period, we begin to find just a kind of riotous chaos of different approaches to duties, different centrality attributed by different figures to the concept of duties, say in their theories of Judaism. That all sounds right. I think Henkin's point was not to claim that, that duties have this or that centrality to Judaism, but just compared to modern liberal commitments to freedom, that the sheer differences amongst Jewish philosophers, ancient or modern, pales beside the difference between pre-modern religious tradition and liberal commitments to freedom. I'm not as sure as you are, coming to the second ground, that it's wrong to say that as a public matter, the discourse of duties has waned. I do agree with you that in the end, whether or not that's correct, we really need to talk at this conference, since I'm not able to do it, not as a non-philosopher, about what specific content ought to be attributed to the doctrine of duties if we decide to revive it. Now, let me then turn to a couple other comments you made. One was really about the history of modern philosophy or contemporary philosophy, and another about the difference between different realms, philosophy versus public discourse versus legal affairs. So the one point on which I would vehemently disagree with you is what significance we assign Rawls in this story. It's not at all that I want to say that he wasn't, in effect, a theorist of duties, since as I would fully, forthrightly acknowledge, any theorist of rights is by definition a theorist of duties. And yet, I think it's wrong to say that he was the first to put freedom and social justice together within the liberal tradition. That was, in a way, the point of my talk, that Mazzini and especially Green were antecedents of the mid-century liberal welfare state. And their central concern was to connect individual freedom and social justice for liberals. And more radically, you might want to argue that actually Rawls let loose the owl of Minerva on the welfare state. In a country like mine, the difference principle has been better observed the day before A Theory of Justice was published than any day since, one might argue. And so that gets to really my central concern here, was that not that liberal theorists are wrong to emphasize rights, though it's the case that, Jeremy's published a book called Liberal Rights, but none called Liberal Duties. But that they've become prisoners to a syndrome in which they're the world historical companions of neoliberal victory. And that wasn't the case for Mazzini and Green, who were in the van of the creation of the welfare state, not companions of its destruction. I also want to acknowledge that there are neoliberal discourses of duty, like personal responsibility. That's why I recommended Yascha Monk's book. Of course, you're right that we need to take very seriously the sociological problem of distinguishing different zones of discourse and practice. No doubt about it. I just would want to emphasize that certain generalizations are possible. We do have such thing as human rights movements. We do have a syndrome in which liberals tend to stand, not excluding religious figures, sometimes alongside religious figures for those rights. Often, the liberals' enemies have gotten ownership or taken custodianship over duties talk, including in a place like this country. And the suggestion is that that's a long-run mistake, in fact, disastrous mistake. You can understand it. Liberals have had to face down, oppression, save religion from its mistaken alliance, you might want to argue, with oppression. And certainly government, it has argued, needed to be limited. But they've failed, at least as a public matter, to make duties all that central. And of course, we'd have to, in the end, have a theoretical argument about what the right scope and content of such a liberal theory of duties ought to be. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. And now we will open the discussion. Please just introduce yourself before you ask him. Yeah, we can start.
Hi, I'm Maureen Rosen from Tel Aviv University, and I'm a historian rather than a philosopher. And I'd like to continue what you started with to talk about from a historical point of view, and that is, I just don't
Wait,
feel
please,
that
if you can just hold up.
a term is understood in the same, it has the same, not just the same cognitive meaning, but it doesn't have the same emotional meaning. And for instance, when you talk about duties, today you feel displeasure. When you talk about rights, you feel freedom and pleasure. So when you reignite this discussion, you also have to take into account the emotional content. And especially when you go back in history and you talk about duties, there was a lot of pleasure in fulfilling duties. Fulfilling the duty was fulfilling also for the person who was fulfilling the duty. So we really have to take that into account.
Do you want to answer?
I agree with that totally. I mean, the sad fact, and this person, she's written some wonderful books about Israeli history and, a place founded by secular socialists very concerned about social justice and the rise of individualism and rights in this country. A place that has been affected by neoliberalism, mounting inequality, many other problems. So, I agree. I mean, the trouble is that duties did get associated in these bad Republican traditions with male military service, also something pretty central to this country, women now taking part. And, presumably we'd want to save the pleasure that was involved, if we can justify such a theory of duties, so that pleasure goes along not with the assertion of autonomy, but with participation and collective interdependence, but it has to be for a good cause. And so if we wanted to characterize this project as neo-Republican, it would have to be unlike any known republicanism, because it would have to save the idea of the duties of citizenship from its military associations, which it's had from Rome to the present.
Seema Kramer, Dr. Seema Kramer from Hebrew University. So I really enjoyed both of the opinions there. And I write about duties in the work context, in the employment context. partly welfare, but also partly individual duties. And I'm really glad that the issue of the content came up, because if you look at human rights, so a certain category of the human rights is the social and economic rights. And the recognition, the legal recognition of certainly the social rights, or the constitutional recognition of the social rights, has lagged behind. And really, if you think about it, a lot of these social rights essentially create duties to act, duties to provide material benefits. And when you ask about content of duties, so duties, and maybe I missed it, I didn't hear you mention, either of you mentioned the sort of coercive element of duties, or the imperative to act. So duties require you to actually do something, in much the same way as social rights require you to do something, and sort of actively go out of your comfort zone and change things, right? It's not a request, it's not a demand, it's an imperative. And I think that, in a way, points to the difficulty, why they become less popular, and I think it's important to emphasize in certain discourses, in certain places, because where do we find, I mean, on the other hand, you can see that there's been a sort of division of labor, right, in terms of who takes care of rights and who takes care of duties. Because the welfare state does take care of some duties, and that sort of releases the pressure, maybe not enough, on the NGOs, okay, but the state takes care of duties, okay. So, but what about the social rights, or the incumbent duties to act in that field? That is lagging, and I don't have an answer. I don't know why the NGOs haven't taken it on. Maybe it's too difficult, or maybe they do enough, but that's just.
Do you want to say? No. What I completely agree with you. One question is whether there's a philosophical problem or whether there's a political problem. And I would tend to think that at this stage it's the latter, since we've had, I pictured Henry Shue and many others since him have written about this, who have laid siege to the notion that positive rights are inherently different in the kinds of coercive duties they may impose on states, or for that matter on other duty bearers. And so it seems like, contrary to the mid-century, at least in Anglophone philosophy, we're better positioned today as a result of developments just in the past 10 or 20 years to make plausible claims about, that justify coercion, to allow these rights to be fulfilled, and maybe other norms, like, the imperative for some more equal society than we are currently building, and that will involve justifiable coercion if the argument's persuasive. But of course, what's not the case is that there's a great deal of political will for the imposition of that coercion, and that's a big problem.
Tomer, just one point. I want to add something to what Sam says, and maybe to what I tried to make. One of the things that are really kind of puzzling about this discussion, and this is the reason why when I read Sam's paper, I tend to disagree with him, yet at the same time, when I thought about, the real life and the discussions I have with my students and my kids and with my colleagues, and when I read the papers and so on and so forth, is that we really don't lack, I would say, discussions about duties at all. People speak all the time about duties. It's not that we don't speak about duties. Duties are all around us all the time, responsibilities. Now then, if this is the case, and I think it would be hard to argue against it, I think I have to say that I was struck when I came as a student to the United States, how much this society, compared even to the Israeli one, is kind of duty-oriented, compared to the Israeli one, in which Israel, you tend to think that because it's a Jewish state and it used to be a collective state, we're all surrounded by duties, and then there was a kind of a change for the kind of the more liberal, but still the basis of the duty-oriented society, which has to do with a combination of the Jewish tradition combined with the socialist collectivist tradition, makes duties here a very central thing. And when I went to the States and I kind of joined the discussion there, the feeling was that we're really behind in terms of duty compared to the Americans. You're kind of squeezed with duties all the time. I don't think that the feeling, when you stand on the line in the United States is that there are no duties. You feel the duty all the time. I remember that whenever I went to a certain clerk and, asked him to kind of bend the rule to a certain, because there were sorts of, he looked at me like, this is, I would say, offense against humanity or something like that. And the feeling was that the problem is not so much that they don't have duties. The problem is really, the fact that I would say the result of the last election, horrible result of the last election in the States, is not so much because Americans, left duties behind. The issue, I think, is what the real duties are. That's the main question here, isn't it? Or
I agree.
Did the liberals fail in the last election because they can't speak about duties? That's the issue. Or they lost the battle because they couldn't make a good argument for certain duties or something like that.
Doesn't have to be either or.
Yes,
Both
absolutely,
can be the
absolutely.
case, and I just would hold out for the viability of some, broad generalizations,
Right.
which may differ from yours.
Professor Waddell?
I'd like to accentuate the distinction that Professor Moyn made at the beginning of his presentation, and I unfortunately didn't get the paper, so I was unable to read it.
It wasn't distributed.
And which then got a little bit forgotten, and I think it's worth underlining. So there's one discourse of duties where if there's a right to health, then the state or public authorities, if they don't have a duty to provide it, that empties that right. And that's the strong sense in which you were saying, I think, that any discourse of rights inevitably implies also a discourse of duties. But it's asymmetrical, which doesn't mean it's not an important discourse. We know from the 70s and 80s when everybody had a desire, they turned it into a right, and often it was empty because there was no corresponding public duty to honor such a right. But it's asymmetrical because the right inures to the individual and the duty on the collectivity. I think more interesting for this conference is to focus on the more delicate issue when the right that we talk about individual rights, to talk about individual duties and responsibilities. And that's not so clear. We all have a right to vote, but very few states, and it's a declining number of states, have a duty to vote. And there are a variety of rights that the duty falls on the state, but it's a big question whether an individual should have the corresponding duty or only the public authority. That's a more delicate discourse, but in some ways more protein and more important to the kind of social ills that the absence of discourse of duty and responsibility. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind. Which duties are we talking of? Duties of the public authorities or duties of individuals, which are equivalent to individual rights? And a suggestion to you, Professor Moyn, if you want to focus on that second aspect, one fertile ground to look at is, and it's been around, I know it's not 19th century, it's 20th century, but it's been around in the modern discourse of rights, is the entire discourse of horizontal rights. When an individual can bring a right against can bring an action against another individual for violating of his or her. So in the United States, violation of civil rights, and in Europe, horizontal rights of directives, etc. Because although they don't discuss in that discourse, they don't use the language of duties, it is just a different way of speaking about duties. If an individual can bring a claim against another individual for violation of his or her rights, and for example, the courts or the state acknowledge such an action, in different words, they're saying that the other individual has a duty to respect those rights. Thank you.
I agree completely. I mean, just on the first point, I think the human rights movement has given us much better wherewithal to assert state duties. But of course, in the end, we have to care equally or more about individual duties, whether towards the state or humanity, which is why I've tried to raise these figures I have, notably Mazzini and Gandhi, who were these cosmopolitan theorists. And if we think concretely about social and economic rights, I think the issue becomes very plain. It's not been thought that social and economic rights bear on taxation. So then we have the paradox of state duties to fulfill social and economic rights, but no connected duties or freestanding duties of citizens to pay higher taxes than they currently do. It's also been thought that social and economic rights are fulfilled within each modular nation state, with some like general comment 3 tiny possibility for some future cosmopolitanism. But of course that sets up a system of poor states maintaining their population under their own power. But if there are in fact individual or duties towards poor states or rich state duties towards poor states, then in fact our prospect for social and economic rights fulfillment changes completely. And so this is the path I think many of us will want to follow.
So Walter?
Hi, Jeremy Warburg from NYU. I much appreciated the talks and particularly the connection between Mazzini and Gandhi. I thought that was very, very helpful. 3 points I just want you to take into consideration. One is what we should say about the role of human dignity, both in relation to rights and in relation to duties, because certainly in its Kantian provenance, human dignity is rooted not just in personal autonomy, but in moral autonomy, which is the capacity of the individual to know the law and to act on the law. So it's very much a moralized duty concept. And even in its modern manifestations, it's far from just libertarian or emancipatory. It recognizes certain duties to self as well as duties to others. So I think that's an important part of the story, about which in the 19th century you know much more than I do. But secondly, just to reinforce Professor Loberbaum's observations about roles, this is a massive body of work that moves in a number of different directions. One that's often neglected is Rawls's insistence that we stop talking about political obligation and start talking about a natural duty to support just institutions anywhere, including just institutions in other countries. That's been massively resisted by rights-minded liberal political philosophers, but it's an extremely important change. It's rooted in Kantian conceptions again, but the notion that we have a natural duty, not dependent as obligation is on choice, but dependent as duty is on simple, objective, morally compelling facts, and that our support for the state is not an option. Our support for just states anywhere is not an option. It's a matter of duty. Very, very important thing, although you're absolutely right, it's one of many. And the other thing to notice about Rawls is that his primary emphasis in 1971 was anti-utilitarian, not anti-duty. Third point, and I don't know how to think about this except that you touched on it slightly in a number of points. We need to think about the role of feminist thought in relation to rights and duties. It's sometimes said comically in relation to American jurisprudence that just as women were starting to get rights, male critical philosophers announced there were no rights. The critique of rights just as soon as women started. And it was one of the reasons why feminist jurisprudence broke away from critical legal studies, is that they had found a tremendous importance in the notion of rights, and they understood all too well who would bear the burden of a return to duties. There's not a whole lot of
Yes.
Women communitarian philosophers for this reason.
Right.
So if we could just take those 3 points into consideration.
No, that's all very helpful. I mean, I think it's true that many people in our times have taken one thing from Kant when he thinks about duty, which is that, dignity, which is that dignity is about, often plain bodily violation and the sacredness of the human person. But of course, that's part of a much broader and richer theory that indeed is about moral agency more broadly. About feminism, I think that's quite important as a claim. But of course, then we need to take into account the kinds of feminism there have been, and it's equally fair to say there's been a big contest over whether to adopt more, individualist libertarian forms of feminism, or whether these care models, which are really about social interdependence, which aren't exactly about duties, but they are about our factual interdependence as human beings, as mothers, mothers and children most graphically illustrate, might need to help us think more deeply about the future of liberalism.
I just want to add to what Jeremy said. I think feminism is a very important point here, especially when you think about returning back to duties in terms of I would say, the public discourse. And you're absolutely right, I think, because I think one of the main achievements of, I would say, liberalism liberalism in general, I would say in the last decades, is really feminism. It's maybe the most significant thing that happened in I would say, Western society in general in the past, I would say, quarter of a century. And it's still way to go, but this is the most important thing happening in the past, I would say, decades. And if you think about this, focusing on this, and then the question is whether returning back to the language of duties, you would pay a real, I would say, deep price about kind of returning back, and this is something that you really should consider if you really focus on feminism. And here I think it's a very important point.
Thank you. Thank you for the fascinating conversation as usual. My name is Ethan Alman. I'm at Haifa University Law School. So I'd like to just really ask a clarifying point on a point you made in passing, which is that you would like to read away the conditionality implied in some of the sources that you discussed regarding duty. And the question is whether you can fairly do that and remain somehow loyal to those sources. In that context, I think that one reading of the sources that you provided to us, with the possible exception of Gandhi, is that what they're really talking about is a kind of contractarianism, social contractarianism, i.e. that there is a duty, but the duty is a reciprocal one, and once one party to the duty does not act upon it, the duty is then rescinded. And that seems to be a very rich vocabulary of duty more generally that is completely omitted from the story that kind of tells us about the decline of duty and the loss of religious duty. Because, paraphrasing the very banal from status to contract, seems to be that we have a very rich, understanding of duties that is contractarian, both in the rights-based conversation on the citizenship level, on the national level, and transnationally and internationally on other levels as well. And this comes into play obviously also in public international law, which you kind of say that does not have this notion of duty, where it's actually very, very central to public international law, this idea of pacta sunt servanda, of reciprocity of duties. And so the question then becomes, what source, you ended the conversation, the talk with the note that you would not like to talk about what is the source of the duty, but it seems that we are left with two sources of duties. One is religious duties, and the other is contractarian duties, and a third one is really unarticulated.
Okay, no, that sounds very helpful, and I'm very grateful. So, as a defender of human rights, I'm very nervous about doctrines that would make them their enjoyment contingent on the fulfillment of prior duties. So that seems like the central idea of human rights is you don't have to do anything to get them, other than species membership. So then the question becomes, do these traditions become useless if we want to maintain that point? But but return to a tradition of liberalism that at least focus more self-consciously on the place of duties amidst, sorry, a place of those individual rights amidst a far larger set of moral norms, most prominently including duties. And of course, I think it ought to be a frontier for exploration, or to the extent it's not already available in various liberal doctrines. I didn't mean to say that duties are absent from contemporary international law. Of course, that would be false. Although we can worry that they've been given insufficient prominence in an age in which many people have been tempted to say that the really radical innovation in international law is making individuals rights-bearing subjects under it. There's a very important new book by German international lawyers Anne Peters called Significantly Beyond Human Rights, which is about the status of the individual in international law, claiming that, well, if we're according individual rights, why not broaden our thinking so that we think that not just states have duties under international law, whether treaty or custom, but individuals too, and then we'd have to think in various ways. So should we be able to argue for some view that maintains a non-conditional set of rights, but supplements those rights with a fuller-bodied picture of individual duties and state duties? Of course, we'd have to have some philosopher argue, and that our process of argument will never end for what the content is. I don't see how it would be possible to claim that the social contract is the only way of establishing a non-conditional set of rights. I think that there should be, I mean, the traditions I happen to invoke today because I think they were so powerful were historicist models of liberalism. The leading figure in this regard would be Hegel, who think very seriously about rights, but as part of a historical process of evolution and progress towards social freedom. So that's another way of establishing non-negotiable rights, which will have limitations, obviously, given other rights, countervailing duties, and so forth. But it establishes those rights in a much larger picture, and of course would have to argue, about the content till the end of time.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Professor Miriam Warman from William Patterson University of New Jersey, and I would like to encourage more focus and research, in fact, on the religious roots of rights. We are so familiar with the duties and responsibilities of Judaism, and Israeli culture is infused with duties, but we should not forget that the Torah and the Talmud also include many examples of rights. Just to give a couple of examples, the rights of slaves, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it's in the Torah, that slaves have certain rights. The rights of animals, and that was also groundbreaking in terms of ancient society, that animals have rights and we have responsibilities to them. When I teach bioethics at William Patterson, and I developed and I teach a number of courses in that area, I always, even though we sidestep religion and we teach secular bioethics, I always start by teaching the religious roots of ethics, the religious roots of bioethics, including the Aseret HaDibra, the Ten Commandments. And so, how much religion has influenced Israeli society, of course, and Judeo-Christian tradition and religion influence American society. I think we really need to keep that in mind and to spend a lot of time considering those influences. And I appreciate how you explain the differences in duties from the Bible, the Talmud, and the Rambam, and I think that was right on target.
Thank you. And now, Leora, we will collect some last questions.
Yeah, Leora from down there at the university. So I was curious what role, and I mentioned this a bit, reciprocity plays in your intellectual history of duties. So I'm coming at this more from a philosophical angle, but when I look at philosophical writings on duty-related ideas that are consistent with the liberal tradition, at least today what you have is a lot of duties that are almost consistently intermingled with ideas of reciprocity that are bringing in sort of egalitarian ideas, right? The insistence not merely on what we owe, but what we owe to each other, right? Kind of following Scanlon seems really significant in the philosophical sort of discourse on duties that's consistent, as I said, with the liberal tradition. And I wonder whether this has anything to do with what you're thinking of as the reemergence of duties in the liberal tradition, although, you know, to some extent, as we've said about lots of other terms, the term reciprocity, doing a good research might sort of be on the rise now, but of course the ideas are latent in much earlier writing. So one point is about its role in the intellectual history and whether sort of ideas of reciprocity also help you on the normative bent of your paper, because if what we're worried about are sort of the pre-modern, the dangers of the pre-modern duty, of course something that's going to come up there is its consistent hierarchical nature, right? Duties to husband, duties to state, duties to parents or whatnot. And if, you know, the idea of duty is conjoined with reciprocity, maybe this sort of staves off certain worries, even maybe the neoliberal worry, which even when we talk about ethic of personal responsibility, it doesn't really seem to be intermingled with the idea of reciprocity in the same way that this sort of, so
Right.
just, you know, curious about whether that plays a role or is important in the project.
Professor Susan Stone, and then we have time to respond.
I love the conversation about reciprocity because I'm going to talk about that on my panel. But I thought here it might be appropriate to just point out that as much as Kant is influential in Rawls, Piaget was influential in Rawls. And that really, you know, some of his notions, which were drawn from developmental psychology, are embedded in this notion of reciprocity. Right? How humans morally develop, the idea of taking turns and, right, and sharing, which plays a very large point in Rawls' story, I think is really puts some of the puzzle of why this arises now back on the table.
Okay, final.
Okay, no, these are wonderful comments and are very helpful. I actually haven't committed to writing a book about the history of duties. I'm more puzzled why there isn't one, and maybe I will write it. So I really appreciate the first point. I personally would deny that we find the concept of rights in Judaism before a certain recent period, which is not at all to say that there aren't moral resources within Judaism and other traditions that have been formulated in rights terms. But there may still be both a reason to insist on the importance of the novelty of rights, but also equally insist that liberals need to care about diverse ethical traditions as they forge their own future doctrines and in a pluralistic world. I personally have not done any research on the intellectual history of reciprocity, but I think it's extremely important for the reasons you both lay out, especially to the extent, as some of you later will do, we want to disaggregate between duties and obligations and responsibility. We may end up with some theory that places reciprocity and mutual acknowledgement and interaction and debt much closer to the focus. Maybe duties is much more resonant of our relationship to the community and state, whereas responsibility is reciprocity is more attentive to our mutual interactions as individuals. I'm not sure. I mean, I'll leave it to later people to develop such thinking. I do agree that if we were to take this story into the 20th century, the concept of reciprocity can become very important. I agree with Suzanne also. You might throw in Jürgen Habermas, who was deeply reliant on a theorist of normative development, Lawrence Kohlberg, and it might be very interesting, along with the feminist argument, to think about how these more 20th century resources help us think in better terms than the 19th century allowed, even if we still want to maintain my insistence that in at least the high intellectual history with which I'm familiar, the 19th century was the great age of duties that's worth another look. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, do you want?
I think the last word should be given to Sam, but I'll say only one word. I'll here quote maybe one of the most important, I would say, claims that Sam makes here in the paper. He says the need to guard against destructive ideas of duty is a poor excuse for ignoring beneficial ones. Now, as a liberal, I have to say that I don't really think it's a poor excuse, at least on the, I would say, the public realm of discussion. One needs to make it, just more to the point. Thank you very much.